Mr. Acting President, well, what an extraordinary piece of legislation we have before this House today. Not as extraordinary as it was last week, but extraordinary nonetheless. It was Machiavelli who is originally credited with saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And how appropriate it is, because it could well be Daniel Andrews that came up with that saying. Because what the Premier of this state has done now for most of 2020 is to use this virus, the Wuhan virus, as something to advance his agenda, something to advance his political goals. And I have to say, I, along with the overwhelming majority of Victorians, have had a gutful. We have had enough. In fact, we have had more than enough. This legislation in its original form was possibly the ultimate power grab. Here was a government that was telling people that they could be arrested and locked up, not for what they had done, but for what they might do in the future. This is the thinking that this government has. Irrespective of the fact they were forced into a backdown, this is the thinking that the Andrews government brings to this parliament. They'll lock you up for what you might do in the future. We're all clairvoyants now, presumably. What an extraordinary proposition. What an appalling proposition. It just goes to show just how much the Premier has totally lost the plot. It just goes to show how out of touch this Premier is with average Victorians. Indeed, Mr. Acting President, it goes to show how out of touch Daniel Andrews is with his backbench. Because his backbench didn't want it, let me tell you. They're furious. And most of his cabinet didn't want it either. But of course, they weren't consulted. They weren't consulted because Daniel Andrews has the Gang of Eight. He's got the Politburo that makes all the decisions for him. And it's a pity, it's a great pity from this perspective, from this House's perspective, there is not one member of this House in the Politburo. Not one member of this House in the Gang of Eight. It's a pretty sad reflection on members of the government, members of the ministry in particular, who are in this House. Very, very sad indeed. But of course, the legislation hasn't changed much at all. You know, there's talk about authorised officers being able to perform the duties, I suppose, reserved normally for police officers. Now, who are these authorised officers? What training might these authorised officers have? Doesn't matter. The Premier says it doesn't matter because this suits his way of thinking. You've got to realise where this bloke's coming from. Daniel Andrews is a hard-line, really dedicated, committed lefty. In years gone by, some might have even called him a communist. But he is undoubtedly as hard left as they come. And this is his mindset. This is his mindset. You do what I say or I will crush you. That's what he's saying to Victorians. That's what he's saying to Victorians. And we have seen that with the curfew. Now, remember the curfew. We couldn't go out after 8 o'clock to start with. Then we couldn't go out after 9 o'clock. Then somebody took it to court. Oh, we can't, out went the curfew. And we found out then that there was no medical advice that justified the curfew. There was no advice from police that justified the curfew. This was something that Mr. Andrews had come up with all by himself. This is a part of a thought process of somebody who wants to control people, who wants to keep people in their place. This is the mindset of a Premier who is totally out of control, and it's just tragic. just tragic that the people of Victoria have had to be subjected for almost the entirety of this year to this man who is, well, you'd have to say he's quite mad at times. And of course, we then have the 5 kilometre rule. We all know about the 5 kilometre rule. You can't go beyond 5 kilometres from your home unless you have a really, really good reason. And if you don't have a really good reason, the police will stop you and they'll take you away and they will fine you for vast sums of money. This 5 kilometre rule is another piece of nonsense from a very nonsensical government. It's got to go. It's got to go. And as a part of that process, Mr. Acting President, what I would like to do at this point in time is to circulate the amendments that the opposition will put forward in committee. If we could,
Mr. Finn, I do believe they've already been tabled over there.
They've been tabled, so people can go and get it themselves.
Wait one moment. Mr. Finn, they're already been put on the table. So if you would like to continue.
News, that is just marvellous news. I'm delighted to hear that because these are particularly good amendments, and one in particular, 16A, which removes the 5 kilometre rule. Now, this is something that should not be up to the opposition to do. This should have been done by the government. In fact, this should never have been introduced by the government. This, as I say, is just another indication of how much the Premier of the state wants to control the people of this state. You know, people, we've had people come in here talking about civil liberties. We've had people talking about how they're libertarians and all this sort of thing. And then some of them have voted to allow this to happen. Quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And I know I'm using that word a lot, but it really is. This legislation and this whole process has been quite extraordinary from the first day. So we in the opposition are urging the House to support amendments 16A. New section 200AA inserted, and also amendment 16B, which inserts a 200AB new section. And I think, well, the ABC, indeed, Ms. Barth, as you quite rightly point out. And I urge the House to take a favourable view of these amendments, in particular the removal of the 5 kilometre rule, because this, I think, will be wildly popular throughout the length and breadth of Melbourne. I don't know anybody who's got a good word to say about this. I was talking to a friend of mine last night who has a new baby. She has no family within 5 kilometres of her home. And her words to me were, "This is driving me insane." She's got a new baby at home. She can't have anybody come to see her. She can't have friends. She can't have relatives, family come to see her to give her a hand because of this 5 kilometre rule. Now, what the hell is going on in the state where new mums can't be helped because of a government regulation? What is going on in this state? What insanity is going on in this state? So I urge the House, when the opportunity arises, to support the amendments, in particular the 16A, because that is a very, very important one. Now, I suppose this bill is asking the question, it begs the question, do we trust the Premier? Do we trust the Premier? Now, I reckon if the pubs were open and we were able to participate in the pub test, we could walk into any pub in Melbourne, any pub in Victoria, and say, do you trust the Premier? And the answer would be an overwhelming not on your Nelly. No way known do Victorians trust the Premier. I have had emails that would curl your hair, some of the language that has been used about the Premier by Victorians. On my own Facebook page, I have had to remove comments from people who have have in very colourful terms described what they would like to do to the Premier. And I've taken it upon myself to remove those because I don't want to be promoting violence. But that's the sort of thing that is going on. People are really, really angry. I have never seen Victorians as angry as they are now. I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the lead up to the '92 election. And that was pretty bad. That was pretty bad. But now, I reckon it's 10 times as bad. I mean, I was going down to get some lunch today, and a bloke stopped me in the street and said, "Do you know where Dan Andrews is?" He said, "I want to see him." And I thought to myself, well, look, I'm not sure whether I should point that out, but I said, but he's up there. And off he wandered. But, you know, people are walking the streets looking for the Premier now. It's quite an amazing situation that we have in this state. So do we trust the Premier? Do we trust the Premier with the powers that he wants in this legislation? No, not in a million years would you trust the Premier to do anything. And we've seen him at the Coat inquiry. We've seen him playing with the truth. We've seen him manipulating the truth. We've seen him tell out-and-out lies. We have seen him have no regard for the truth at all in regard to the Coat inquiry, or indeed quite often in these interminable press conferences that he has. And, it was quite extraordinary. Last week the ALP put an ad out, or a tweet out I think it was, and said, congratulations, 100 press conferences. Well, that's 100 days of misery for Victorians. 100 days of death for Victorians. 100 days of death of destruction for Victorians. That's what that was. But the ALP thought it was worth celebrating anyway. Just goes to show, as I say, how out of touch they are. Totally and absolutely out of touch with reality. The fact of the matter is that this government and this Premier are traumatising Victorians. They're traumatising old people, many of whom have been sitting in their homes for the last 7 or 8 months without seeing another living or breathing soul. They're traumatising little kids who all they want to do is go and see their friends. Now, up until yesterday, they couldn't do that. There's still a section of the school community who can't, including 2 of my daughters who are still at home. Now, they haven't seen their friends for months and months and months. They're being traumatised by a government that just doesn't care. And as I said before, for the rest of us, well, we don't seem to matter. We don't seem to matter. The rest of the community just doesn't seem to matter as long as Daniel Andrews can flex his muscle and show what a big he-man he is, and how strong he is, and how he can tell people what to do and how to live their lives. That seems to be his ultimate. His party. No, as Ms. Crozier says, his party is not happy with him at all. As I mentioned earlier, it's very, very, very true indeed. And we have a situation where members of his own party are openly speaking to the media about how they want him to go. Labor members of Parliament are openly speaking to the media now about how they want a new leader. They're talking about the need. They want him gone by Christmas. I reckon they want him gone by about dinner time if they could. They'd have him out the door now if possible. And I'm told that the meetings around the corridors of this building today have been, I think, instructive, to say the very least, because you've had little groups here and little groups there, and they're not talking about whether Richmond's going to beat Port Adelaide on Friday night. I've got a feeling they are very much talking about whether Daniel Andrews will survive, and I don't think he will. I don't think he will, and I don't think he should. I don't think he should. He doesn't deserve to survive the job, because as Premier he has been an unmitigated unmitigated disaster. Indeed, he is an unmitigated disaster. And I just hope, whether it be the Coate inquiry or whether it be Peter Credlin, I just hope that somebody gets to the truth. Well, Peter will, I've got no doubt about that. But I just hope that somebody gets to the truth of this whole thing very, very soon, because, as I said earlier, the people of Victoria have had a gutful. They've had a gutful, and they're saying, Daniel Andrews, you've already got too much power. We don't want you to have any more, and I will oppose this bill.